All right. Okay. Good evening to everybody. I'm Rabbi Julie here again for our week 4 of our 5 weeks on Jews in Search of God, from the Bible to Kabbalah. And today we'll look at, we're going in a different direction with some, looking at some rationalist Jewish philosophers, people who came to Judaism from the point of view of philosophy, influenced by Greek and Hellenistic thought, and then how that's influenced us. I feel like this, I'm just going to be honest up front and say, like, this is not my biggest area of expertise because I specialized in rabbinic literature. And even though, you know, Maimonides is a rabbi, and I did take a course on Maimonides, but when I was saying rabbinic literature, that was up through the Talmud, and he lived later than that. But I think what I can share a lot is how Maimonides influenced our Jewish thought today, because he helped shape the way that we see Judaism, the way that we see God, and even what we think about as belief. So let me start with sharing the screen. And as I share my screen, we've determined that, let's see, oops, no, you're seeing my Amazon screen. There, can you see this? Can you see the slide?
See your Amazon screen right now.
Oh, again.
There you go.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Jews in Search of God. Okay. So if I try to share this as a slideshow, I find that's when I get the problems with Zoom. I'm not sure why, but it tends to kick me off, like can't handle it. So I'm just going to show it to you this way, even though you don't have a perfect view of it. So Jews in Search of God, and I didn't make a slide to review the last 3 weeks, but by way of review, I'll say that the first week we focused on views of God in the Bible, in the Tanakh, and then views of God in rabbinic literature in the Talmud and Midrash. That was the second week. The third week was about goddesses, the feminine, divine feminine. And now we're going a little bit later in history, although with Philo, not so late, but into Maimonides and rationalist views of God. So I like to start with a song. Can you sing that where it says song Ani Ma'amin? Can you guys see that? Okay. I picked this song because, well, we're going to be talking about belief and how Maimonides formulated these 13 articles of belief, and they became really part of Jewish liturgy. When we say, you know, the Ani Ma'amin, I believe with perfect faith, those came from beliefs that Maimonides formulated, and one of them became a very famous song. Well, they all became a song called Yigdal, but this one became this famous song, Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema, because it's associated with people in the Holocaust who, even as they were losing their lives, would say this or sing this, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, which to me shows something about what Judaism thinks about belief, that belief in Judaism isn't really a set of propositions or a credo. It's really a belief in the future, a belief in a faith in what is to be. But anyway, here's Ani Ma'amin. If you know it, you can sing it along with me. If not, just kind of hum it along with us on mute, unfortunately. Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, be'emunah shelema, be'emunah shelema, beviat HaMashiach, beviat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, beviat HaMashiach, beviat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, be'emunah shelema, be'emunah shelema, beviat HaMashiach, beviat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, beviat HaMashiach, beviat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin. Of course, this is, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, one of Maimonides' articles of faith. And now the prayer for the study of Torah. Can you all see that? Prayer for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Holy One of blessing, your presence fills creation. You've made us holy with mitzvot and bid us to engage with words of Torah. All right. So let me stop the share here. Okay. Today we'll be looking, among other things, at the influence of Greek thought on Judaism and on Jewish thinkers, because both Philo of Alexendria and much later Maimonides are influenced by Hellenism, by Greek philosophy and Greek thought. And this is Hellenism, or Hellenization, is the idea that conquered peoples, including the Jews, were influenced by Greeks during the Greek Empire. Greek civilization in ancient times is said to run from 1200 BCE to the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, but we know even later into the Hanukkah story, 165 BCE, as the Greeks ruled, the Greeks split into two different branches of the empire, but Jews were very much being influenced by Hellenism. So remember back at Hanukkah, not so long ago it was Hanukkah, and we were talking about the Maccabees fighting the Greeks, and how in reality there was also a civil war happening between the Jews who were traditionalists and those that became Hellenized and became kind of following Greek ways of life, Greek culture. But okay, so there's a struggle of traditional Jewish values of Torah and mitzvot and this new and attractive Greek culture that was taking over the world. But that's not the whole story. And in fact, I think it's important to note that there's always been kind of a synergy and a blend between Jewish and Greek culture, and that's what shaped the Western world. So a century and a half before the Hanukkah story, Alexander the Great, the leader of Greece, conquered the known world, including Judea. There's a story in the Talmud, again, it's the stuff of legend, that when he arrived in Jerusalem, the high priest, Simon the Just, went out to meet Alexander, and to his great surprise, Alexander dismounted from his horse and bowed low. When he questioned, Alexander explained that whenever he went into battle, he dreamed of an angel leading him to victory. The face of the Jewish high priest was the face of that angel that he'd seen in his dreams. He allowed the Jews their autonomy, and in gratitude, every Jewish boy born that year was named Alexander, and Alexander remains a Hebrew name, even though it's a Greek name. So that is legendary, obviously, but it shows, I think, that from the start, there's been some merging of Jewish and Greek culture, not only a struggle. The struggle of Hanukkah is only part of our story, and we need both worlds. Historians tell us that all Western civilization is a combination of Athens and Jerusalem, of Greek ideas like democracy, philosophy, combined with Jewish values and ethics of right and wrong. So let me share again with the slides. Okay. I'm going to skip to this one. Okay. When we're talking about the influence of Greek thought on Judaism over time, as Jews embraced Greek philosophy, and it began to, find its way into even the way that the rabbis saw things and the way that later Jewish thinkers saw things. One of the issues is the whole idea of proving that God exists, because we saw that in the Bible, there's no attempt to prove that God exists or be logical about God or defend the idea of God. Also with the rabbis, we saw there was no systematic theology. They assumed God existed. God's there, God's interacting with people, there's encounters with God. And when we got to Greek thought, there's a need to prove God in some way, to have a rational proof of God. And another influence of Greek thought is the idea of dualism. That is, that body and soul, that physical and spiritual are two different realms. In biblical thought and in Jewish culture in ancient Israel, those things were not really seen as separate. Body and soul, like nephesh, meant kind of like body soul. There wasn't really such an idea of the spirit or soul as an entity separate from the body. It's like a force that enlivens the body. And really the influence of Greek and other and some other religions and Greek thought gave us this idea of the split of body and soul. So here we have a quote from Professor Rachel Elior from Hebrew University on how one of the Greek influences on Jewish theology of the soul as having a spiritual character different from the physical world. And I forgot to ask you if you would like to read. Well, there's not a lot of people here tonight, but if people would like to read, why don't you raise your hand electronically so that the Herschelers can call on you. And go ahead and be bold and read, because we need some readers. Okay. All right.
Ellen, please unmute.
I gotcha.
Okay.
The rabbinic view of the soul as an entity having a spiritual character and as a fixed, defined metaphysical element almost certainly developed under the influence of Orphic and Platonic Greek thought. We may assume, too, that the Greek view of the soul as belonging to the realm of the divine, infinite and eternal, and the body to the realm of the material, finite and mortal, also left its mark upon Jewish thought. Plato's idea of the pre-existence and eternity of the soul derived from his dualistic outlook, which set matter and spirit at odds with one another, was also influential. We must bear in mind, however, that for all that the dualistic anthropology expressed in the rabbinic text had in common with the Platonic and Stoic attitudes current in the Hellenistic world, the rabbinic sages' conception of this dualism and of the conflict between the flesh and the spirit was far less radical than that of the Greeks, who viewed body and soul as an absolute dichotomy.
Okay. So this very idea that we've got a soul like inside our body and it's separate, and maybe it has some kind of survival outside of our physical body. This is things that gradually developed, and we don't really see them as much in the early, maybe just hinted in early biblical thought. And, you know, dualism definitely is an issue. And I think you'll see in both of these thinkers, in Philo and later in Maimonides, that the mind and the spirit are superior, the body and materiality are inferior. And those things were not necessarily original Jewish ideas, but they really crept into Jewish thought by way of this philosophers. So one other thing I want to show you before we get into Philo and then Maimonides is I'm calling this types of modern believers. Can you see that on the screen? Types of modern believers. I got the types from Professor Neil Gilman, a great professor at Jewish Theological Seminary, who passed away just a few years ago. I got to take classes with him, not at the seminary, but at some conferences. And he wrote some books on modern Jewish theology, trying to make sense of what we believe in the modern world. But I've added my own description to those types. So I think there's three main types, and you might ask yourself, which type am I? Because today we're going to look at rationalist thinkers, or rationalist theologians, people who want to prove God exists, who say it has to be something rational, it has to make sense. So I say, this is a little tongue in cheek, but I say for the rationalists, God just makes sense. But then that's not the only way to see God. And this whole idea that you have to prove God exists and it has to be logical is really, I think, part of the legacy of the Greek world and then the Christian world, the Western world, right? But there are other ways that we could come to our personal belief, if you will, our personal theology. One is the empiricist or experientialist, who would, I would describe this as not God makes sense, but I sense God. I just sense God. In other words, I experienced, I had some kind of a mystical experience, or I had some kind of a spiritual or mysterious or awesome experience, and I sense God's presence in my life. And then I try to figure it out. That's like Reb Zalman said, theology is the afterthought of the believer after the experience. For the rationalist, it's logical. You have to think about it. You come to it mentally. And then Gilman also gave a third type, which is religious existentialists like Martin Buber. And hopefully we'll learn about these different ideas next year, God willing. Religious existentialists would say, not God makes sense or I sense God, but my life just makes sense because of God. In other words, I've been through some hard times. I've struggled, or we've struggled as a people, but we find in our very existence, the thing that keeps us going is some kind of idea of God, something bigger than ourselves, whatever that might be, helps us make sense of our life. So those are my three kind of catchy ways to describe the difference. The rationalist says God makes sense. The empiricist says I sense God, experience. And the existentialist says my life makes sense because of God. I put religious existentialists because for some existentialist philosophers, which again is a modern kind of philosophy, they are not religious, right? But so there are those who are religious existentialists. And then I put in the little box here, of course, in the modern world, not everyone is a believer. There are those who are atheists who say, I don't believe in God. God does not exist. Some of them are rather militant in that belief. Some are more like, well, I just don't see any reason to believe in God. And then the agnostic who's like, I'm not sure. I don't know. Like, I don't know what I think. I'm not sure what I believe. And even with the atheist, we might say, well, you know, maybe the God that the atheist doesn't believe in is this kind of simplistic view of God that we talked about week one, like the king, the old man in the sky sort of thing. And if we start looking at different ideas of God, that atheist might say, well, I could believe in this God, this idea of God, but I can't believe in the God that I learned about, you know, back in Sunday school, way back when. So just keep these ideas in mind. These are modern ideas, but I think I want to bring them to mind as we look at these rational philosophers about God, that's only one way to approach God. So before we look at the two thinkers, any questions, first of all, about, well, and also I thought you could put in the chat, have you thought about yourself? Would you call yourself a rationalist, a empiricist, or experience, you know, comes from my experience, don't worry exactly about the word, or existentialist, it just helps me get through life because I believe, or I'm just an agnostic, or I'm an atheist, I'm coming out of the closet as an atheist here, you know, it's okay, because there's lots of Jewish atheists too. Okay, empiricist. Yeah, well, I'm not going to bias anyone by giving my point of view yet until you put something. Feel free to put. We've got empiricist, reconstructionist. Well, what I think reconstructionist, Kaplan was a rationalist. Like his God had to make sense, right? It wasn't, and a very different kind of sense than Maimonides, but it was very rational, right? You want to say something about that, David?
Yeah, well, you know, I grew up in a Reform movement, and then spent much of my young adult life at conservative synagogues, and then found out when I joined a Reconstructionist congregation that I actually have always been a Reconstructionist, meaning that, you know, that the Kaplan view that God is inside each of us, and each of us, you know, determines how God is seen internally and is described externally.
Very good. Well, I'd say a lot of people, when they learn about Reconstructionism, say, hey, that's me. There is a word for that, what I am. But I would say, I think it's fair to say it goes under the rationalist. I mean, the classic Kaplanism. Not all Reconstructionist Jews think that way, but Kaplanism, but too much for tonight. But hopefully next time we do the seminar, we'll learn about that. Okay, now we have a rational empiricist. So I want to know what does that mean to you, Michael, to be a rational empiricist?
I feel like I've experienced God directly.
Yeah.
But I always am, it's not like I'm looking for proof, but God kind of proves themselves to me, you know, when I do things like, you know, I'm a photographer and a videographer, and I find that in some of the work that I do. So I really think that I need to, I guess I look for I look for proof, or proof just comes, I guess is what it is. I guess that's the best way to describe it.
And well, I could say maybe it needs to make sense.
Right.
Is that
Yeah,
fair?
but it
It's not
does
just
make
like
sense.
I had an experience, but then I want to make sense of my experience and be able to describe it in a more, it's almost like what they say, the right brain, left brain, right? I had this kind of holistic feeling, but now I need to analyze it. And in fact, on the tefillin, by the way, to get a little poetic, if you wear tefillin on your head, one side has the 3-pronged shin and one has the 4-pronged shin, right and left brain, Reb Zalman said. Synthesis and analysis, we have this holistic experience and we have to analyze it. Okay, I'm getting a little woo-woo, but you know.
There's a filmmaker who said she has her eyes on the horizon and her feet on the ground. I mean, that's kind of how I feel.
Okay, beautiful. I like that. And I think for us as modern Jews too, one of the ways that religion needs to make sense is in relation to science. And, you know, for a lot of us, we can kind of compartmentalize and say, well, science is about scientific facts, religion is about ethics or morals or emotions. But I just wanted to share in the chat this website called Sinai and Synapses. You might want to take a look at that. I know the rabbi who started that, and it's just very interesting. It's an organization that is trying to, you know, help people explore Jewish. Well, I think they have other people of other religions take part in it too. How does religion mesh with science? Because for these earlier thinkers, it was how does religion mesh with philosophy, Greek philosophy in particular, but now it might be how does it, you know, square with science. Okay, so, and then some people, I guess, have not decided or do not wish to say what style of believer or non-believer they are. You're not sure yet. That's okay too. I want to now go ahead and look at the two thinkers that we want to share about tonight. All right, so here we go back to the slideshow, hopefully. First is Philo. We don't really know if Philo looked that way and wore that funny hat, but apparently somebody in the 1500s made a picture of him like that, and people think, you know, that became famous, picture of Philo. But Philo, we're not even sure. We're not, sorry, okay. Yeah, we're not sure exactly what years he lived. There's only one event in his life that we kind of document what year it actually occurred, when he took part in this, he took part in a delegation the year 40 Common Era of the Jewish community to the Emperor Caligula in Rome. And so we know when that happened. And at that point, he said that he was an older man at that time. So they can just estimate when he lived around 20 BCE, before the Common Era, to around 50 Common Era in Alexandria, Egypt, a city in northern Egypt, which was, according to our book, the leading commercial and intellectual center of the country and the chief meeting place of Greek and Eastern cultures. It became, you know, there was a very big, famous Jewish community there with a massive synagogue. It said that the synagogue was so big that for people in the back to know when to say amen, they had people in the front waving flags, like, so the people in the back could see, I guess. And they also, that is the city, the culture that brought us the first translation of the Bible into Greek, the Septuagint. It's so called because the legend has it that 70 different scholars translated it and they all came up with the same translation, and that's the name. Maybe there's a big committee of 70, I don't know, but that's the source of the Septuagint, this Greek translation. He was from a wealthy and prominent family, and he was a philosopher, scholar, and diplomat. He also influenced, well, the question is, how important was he really to Judaism, to the development of Judaism? Maybe not so much. Obviously, he wasn't known like as a rabbi, or and he was outside the land of Israel or the big community in Babylonia. But his thought seems to have somehow influenced rabbinic midrash, because he liked allegorical, you know, as you read in your chapter, and Finding God, he liked allegorical interpretations of scripture in particular, which made its way into the Midrash. Apparently, he was also a big influence on the development of later Christianity. So I'm just bringing a couple of things that he said, and we'll need some readers for this. We have somebody ready to read this. First, so we're going to see two different logical or rational ways of describing of that God exists. And this is called the teleological argument. In other words, it's the argument from design that if you see the world, the creation, you know there must be a creator. The end takes you back to the beginning, to the thing that created it, or the force or being that created it. So we have a reader for that. And then
yes, Elsa.
Okay, and the next slide will be a continuation. Someone else can read it though. Okay.
Okay. It has invariably happened that the works which they have made have been in some degree the proofs of the character of the workman. For who is there who, when he looks upon statues or pictures, does not at once form an idea of the statuary or painter himself, and who, when he beholds a garment or a ship or a house, does not in a moment conceive a notion of the weaver, a shipbuilder, or architect who has made them. And if anyone comes into a well-ordered city in which all parts of the constitution are exceedingly well arranged and regulated, what other idea will he entertain but that this city is governed by wise and virtuous rulers? Philo of Alexendria, Special Laws.
Okay. So we're getting from, I think, pretty obvious. Like today I was just walking down the walking path here in Lewis, and I saw a pile of rocks, like a big one on the bottom and smaller ones, and I looked at that and thought, somebody put that together. That didn't just happen. That is some intentional, right? And if all the more so if I had seen a beautiful statue like those ones in the picture, or a beautiful, I saw a house going up nearby where those rocks were, I say, somebody's building that. This didn't just happen. So he's taking in this direction, all the more so. So next reader. Who's reading next? Okay, you got to unmute Hirschlers. You're muted.
Barbara, could you unmute?
Barbara Aleutian.
Barbara Aleutian.
Okay. Okay. Barbara can't unmute yourself. You got to figure out how to unmute yourself. If you're looking on a laptop, it will be in your lower left hand.
There you go. There you go.
Okay. You got it. You did it.
He therefore who comes into that which is truly the greatest of cities, namely this world, and who beholds all the land, both the mountain and the champaign district full of animals and plants, and the streams of rivers, both overflowing and depending on the wintry floods, and the steady flow of the sea, and the admirable temperature of the air, and the varieties and regular revolutions of the seasons of the year. And then too the sun and moon, the rulers of day and night, and the revolutions and regular motions of all the other planets and fixed stars, and of the whole heaven. Would he not naturally, or I should say rather, of necessity conceive a notion of the Father and Creator and Governor of all this system, for there is no artificial work whatever which exists of its own accord?
Okay. All right. So pausing there. So this is this teleological argument, the argument, from design, there's a creation. There must be something behind that creation. And maybe even the more you know about it, the more you wonder at it, and the more that we know today about science and everything in the world, would we be even more convinced of this? Of course, not necessarily, but I wonder what if this argument, speaks to people, even today as modern people. And of course, there's a very idea that he had to put forth an argument shows that people were questioning, right? And the Bible's just, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We don't have to prove to you there's a God. It happened. Nobody had to prove it. If they didn't believe it, who even thought about it? I guess they kept it to themselves if they didn't believe it. But at this point, you wouldn't be convincing people if some people didn't believe it. So your thoughts, how does that play in modern times? Michael?
Okay. Yeah, I've just got a question. I've never understood why scientists, a lot of rational scientists, say that science is proof that there isn't a God. The whole thing, for me, science is proof that there is a God if God needs to have proof.
Well, I think that's there's different. I can't speak as a scientist, only as a rabbi, so I'm a little biased.
Maybe there's a scientist here. I don't know.
But for sure, there are some people I know, I've read who are scientists who are believers, and not all scientists are unbelievers, and some who are Christians, Jews, and other religions who feel that their science, it's not that it has to accord completely like with the biblical account of creation. They're not saying, that, but they're saying they're so amazed by everything they learn that they see the wisdom of the creator, so far beyond anything we could invent, and others would say, no, if you give enough time and enough, there's enough billions of years, it can all just happen. We don't quite know why, but that doesn't mean there's a creator behind it. I don't know. So
Ellen has her hand up. I don't know if it's
Ellen, did you want to comment? Or you just okay. Yeah, so like I said, again, if you wanted to visit Sinai and Synapses, I feel to discussion maybe for another time, but definitely what can I, like for me, when I see the wonders and awe of nature, I am assuming a creator. I do say, sometimes people would say to me, with my nature photography, that's a beautiful photo. And I'm kind of like, well, all I did was push the button. I mean, in a sense, it took a good picture, but what I'm looking at is creation or the wonders of God's world and the great artist, and I'm just the amateur photographer. And but I got used to just not explaining that and just saying thank you. But I think a lot of people that say, well, I feel close to God in nature, there's a sense either that the creation of God, or that it's imbued with God, like this is an expression of God. And we'll get to next year into like pantheism, Spinoza, or panentheism, and even in Kabbalah, we'll see, the Shekhinah infusing the world. There's something divine and awesome about nature. Any other responses here to Philo and his idea of nature tells us the creation points to the creator? Well, I'm going to yes.
Yeah. I was going to say that I have seen some absolute miracles, which I could never explain.
As a doctor, people don't know you're a surgeon, and with nothing in any book you ever read can explain how something like that could have happened, but absolute miracles. And they're, I don't have an other kind of explanation for why that could be. So something you, even as a person of medicine and science,
that I've seen with my own eyes, you know?
So you see these miracles or things. Yeah. Well, that's something, again, we'll see with Maimonides, that he differed from the Greeks because he had to have miracles. Greek philosophy didn't really allow for miracles. But as a Jew, he did see that. But for you as a scientist or, as a doctor, does the things you learned, like in medical school, make you more and reinforce your faith? I don't know how to say that. Did it somehow point you towards faith, or was it neutral, or did you ever go, hey, God could have done a better job on this, or what?
I can't say that I ever really thought of it in those terms, but like I said, I've just seen miracles with my own eyes that if you had told me about them, I wouldn't have believed it, but really, there's no other explanation.
I appreciate hearing that. Thank you. Thanks. Well, let's go. I do appreciate hearing that. Thank you. And it's so worthwhile to hear people from different life experiences to come and share, what influenced your faith. And also in your Judaism, like how it influences and informs who you are in the rest of your life. So this is also from Philo. One more thing. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, one more thing from Philo, because I really want to spend most of the time on Maimonides, who's a much more important Jewish thinker. But what I'd like to, this is from Philo's commentary on the Torah, where he really exalts the mind, that the Bible says we're made in God's image, it's talking not about our physical form, but our mind. And that, again, is an important contribution, if you want to call it that, an influence of Greek thought, again, of mind over matter, right? Spirit over body. So, and I think Maimonides also really vaunted and valorized the mind and the intellect and the contemplation of God. So do we have someone who'd like to read here?
Gabrielle.
Okay.
Mankind was made in the image of and likeness of God. Nothing that is born on the earth is more resembling God than man. And let no one think that he is able to judge of this likeness from the characters of the body. For neither is God a being with the form of a man, nor is the human body like the form of God. But the resemblance is spoken of with reference to the most important part of the soul, namely the mind. For the mind which exists in each individual has been created after the likeness of that one mind which is in the universe as its primitive model, being in some sort the God of that body which carries it about and bears its image within it. In the same rank that the great governor occupies in the universal world, that same as it seems does the mind of man occupy in man, for it is invisible, though it says everything itself, and it is an essence which is undiscernible, though it can discern the essence of all other things, and making for itself by art and science all sorts of roads leading to diverse directions and all plain. It traverses. It traverses land and sea, investigating everything which is contained in either element.
Reading. I picked this up off of an online translation of Philo, so sorry if it's a little awkward. But the basic idea is when it says we're made in God's image, it's where our mind is made in God, and we're like God because God's the divine mind rules the world, and our mind rules our body, just as our mind, not necessarily our brain, but like our mind, whatever that means, rules our physicality. The divine mind, the universal, occupies the universal world, right? And it's invisible. Again, this idea of its invisibility, it can't be seen. In essence, all these ideas I think, are influenced by Greek thought. So even if they didn't have the same idea about God, but this idea of dualism. So again, I'm turning to you to ask you, have you thought about God, finding God as something mental, something of the mind or consciousness? I like to think of it connected to consciousness itself. It's kind of but now I'm getting into the mysticism. Okay, empiricist here. The mysticism, the very consciousness being part of this bigger consciousness, or is it our very faculty of reason that brings us closer to divinity? Any responses to this or thoughts on this?
Can you restate the question, please?
Was there a question in there? Have you considered, do you feel a connection to God that's mentally based, or based in your mind? Do you think of that as a way of relating to God or finding your divinity within? Okay, Gabrielle, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was looking for raise the hand. Sorry.
Yes, okay.
I'm remiss. Sometimes when I'll use the word following intellectual pursuits. I'm giving myself a lot of credit there, but an idea literally comes from nowhere. And yes. I often give credit to God, and it's interesting because I've had teachers or mentors that just say, "Oh, and you underestimate yourself," as a student. I thought, or whatever. Yeah. But over years, I realized, no, that's not an underestimation. It is God, and so I really get that a lot in my just good, if I don't say good idea, but just different ideas. And I think that's intellectual pursuits.
I appreciate that comment a lot. And I think we'll see some language for that in Kabbalah. There's this idea of the chokhmah, this spark that just comes, flashes, and then, you have to kind of incubate it, think about it, bring it down into the world, but that it's a divine insight. I mean, a spark of genius. Where do geniuses get their ideas? And then you could take it into, where did Mozart get his musical ideas, right? Where did great artists get their ideas? This sparks of genius. People say, well, it's a gift from God. They're touched by God. Do we think that way? It's something that's coming to us. That's
the word is inspiration.
Inspiration, which is Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit, Ruach. Inspiration, yeah. Appreciate that. Anybody else? Thoughts about the mind and God, or your relationship to God?
Elsa?
Maybe in the expression when you say it's bashert, because it's amazing the number of coincidences out there and how things just gel, and you just happen to be there, and because you were there, you met so and so, and
well, that's now getting on the mystical side. I don't know what Maimonides would think of that, but definitely Hasidim, the Hasidic thought, it comes out of Kabbalah, and maybe we'll learn more about that a little bit next week and going into next class, God willing, is, this idea of things being bashar, it's hashgacha pratit, it's divine providence. I guess all these fall into the category of things we can't explain. So, and these rationalists like to explain things. One thing I'd like to say is a critique of it, which my professor Harold Leibowitz brought up in when I was studying about Maimonides in graduate school, is that here's the problem. One of the problems is that not everyone has a great intellect. Does that mean that people who have Down syndrome, maybe, and they might be limited in their intellectual achievements, and yet they could be very loving, very spiritual, very emotional, and people feel that their love and their genuineness is a manifestation of God. And with Maimonides, when he's saying, well, really, if your mind is developed, you can achieve those great heights of contemplation. And what if you're not able to do that? Can you still, is there something a little off here if we say that, well, it's only about them, or the highest expression is the mental achievements? Is that valorizing that above everything else? Just something to think about. At any rate, there's a little bit of Philo. And I have to say the disclaimer again is that neither one of these, and particularly Philo's not my area of expertise, but I hope our book will bring something to you. And then we'll look a little bit more at Maimonides. Now, Maimonides, I did take my first course in graduate school was on Maimonides. And that was a great class because if you learn Maimonides, you kind of have to learn about everything that came before and after. Because what Maimonides did is take this vast body of rabbinic literature that had already been formulated in the preceding centuries, create like the first code of Jewish law, create interpretations of it, and make sense of it, of a very big body of literature, and reframe it for people that had been exposed then to Greek thought, which had been revived by the Arabs, in the Middle Ages, as they preserved it, and there were translations, and for people that were studying this philosophy and might be placing less importance on the biblical tradition, rabbinic tradition, Maimonides, in his brilliance, was able to synthesize it all, right? And so he brought together everything that came before. He influenced everything that came after. On his tombstone, it says, from Moses to Moses, there's none like Moses. In other words, from Moses, number one in the Bible, to Moses Maimonides, no one arose like him. And apparently he approved that to go on his tombstone. He definitely had lots of self-esteem. So he was a very confident guy. But we'll see a little bit about Maimonides. But again, once again, taking one course in graduate school does not make you an expert on Maimonides. Reading a few books, there's so much written on him, and I just give you, a little bit of what I know, and we can mostly see if we can apply it to things that are important to us. Okay. Can you see this Maimonides, AKA Rambam? Yeah. Okay. So, and there's a statue of him in Cordoba, and there's a picture I took of an eagle because he's called the Great Eagle. So Moshe ben Maimon, or Moses ben Maimon, aka Maimonides, the Greek version, son of Maimon, aka also known as the Rambam, which stands for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. It's his acronym. We do know when he lived, 1138 to 1204 Common Era. He was born in Spain, where there was a great Jewish community, and we often hear of the golden age of Spain when Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in harmony. But at the time Maimonides was born, there was a rather fanatical group of Muslims, the Almohadin, who were conquering Iberia, I guess, and his family had to flee, really. They had to flee for their lives. They went down to Morocco. Later, they tried the land of Israel, then called Palestine, and that wasn't possible. So they went to Egypt, to Fostat, which is out like a neighborhood of Cairo, or a town next to Cairo. That's where he lived most of his life, although he's buried in Israel. So the way I describe Maimonides is every Jewish mother's dream, because imagine this: my son, the doctor, and my son, the lawyer, and my son, the community leader, and my son, the philosopher, and my son, the astronomer. He was kind of everything. So he was one of the greatest Jewish intellects of all time, and one of the greatest rabbis. And really, he changed the way we see Judaism. His lens is the way we see things. But we need to ask ourselves, is everything he said just completely in line with the way it was in rabbinic thought? Not only, because he also brought in Greek philosophy, Neo-Aristotelianism, and he tried to square that with Judaism and created something new in a way, right? All right, so we're gonna, again, I could just give you really a taste of his thought. And I shared some articles Audrey sent out to you, some links with simple articles about him, but also a translation of something that he wrote from the Mishnah that we'll look at in a bit. So here's one of his arguments for God, Rambam. This is called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. So who would like to read this?
Okay, Alan.
If it is as you say, this stone which was in motion was moved by a staff, the staff was moved by a hand, the hand by tendons, the tendons by muscles, the muscles by nerves, the nerves by natural heat, and the natural heat by the form that subsists therein. This form being undoubtedly the first mover.
Some kind of energy, is it, right?
Energy.
Yeah, the heat, natural heat, I guess, is the energy. Okay, so he keeps going and continue our commentary there.
If one were to project this movement all the way up to the cosmic scene, one would end up with a universal mover, and that is God.
Okay. And again, this comes from, he's basing this on Aristotle, except for that, as you saw in our book, again, in this Finding God Selected Responses, that he differed from Aristotle and the Greeks because he didn't believe that the world was pre-existent and that it had always existed, but he has to say, looking at the Torah, that God created. So God created I'm not saying, know if I'm saying it right, ex nihilo, or out of nothing, from nothing. And he had to have kind of a doctrine of creation that wasn't in Greek thought. So basically, this is a logical argument that if you start with something you see and you take it up as high as you can, there's got to be the unmoved mover. There is something that was the beginning of everything, and that is God. It's a logical thing that he wants to share with us. But when it comes to defining what God is like, it gets a lot more complicated. Again, but I wanted to say is, where does he discuss these Greek ideas? In his great book that's called The Guide for the Guide, it's sometimes called The Guide for the Perplexed, The Guide of the Perplexed. that's a book. I think people know the title, but like reading it is really hard. I found it it's very dense, opaque, and hard to read. He wrote it in particular for one student or one of his elite, or it was for a very small elite. And he made it confusing on purpose, or else it was just so darn hard that it's very hard to follow. And he didn't have to do that, because Maimonides himself could do things in a very simple and clear way that everyone could understand. And he often did that. And when he wanted to make it obscure and obtuse, he also could do that. So this idea of the unmoved mover and, logical proofs of God based on Greek thought, that is in the Guide for the Perplexed for the elite, those people that want to understand both philosophy and Judaism. But he wrote other great works. I mean, it's mind-boggling kind of what all the things that he wrote. He first of all, he authored the first code of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah. You know what? I meant to put it on a slide. Let me see if I can just show you guys because I forgot to put it on a slide. Oh, dear me. But I had a picture of it on my shelf at home. And I want to show you how the size of it, kind of. Okay. Hold on. Okay. Let's see if I can. Okay, let me see if I can show you. Yeah, here it is on my shelf when I was back in Pennsylvania. You can see that? Do you see this? Okay, that's my shelf, my bookshelf in my other house. But this is his code of Jewish law. Although this is the simple version for us regular folks called Rambam La'am, like the popularized version in Hebrew. It's all in Hebrew, but it's with like vocalized Hebrew and an explanation. And what he did is create this first code of Jewish law, which he took all the laws in the Bible and the Talmud, which is, as you know, now is huge and voluminous. And he said he took all the many questions that weren't answered and he just distilled it to what you do. But he did it in a logical way because, again, rationality and logic is important to him. He begins with talking about who is God? What is God? That's where you start. And then he gets into beliefs and religion and every topic in a very rational way, not the illogical and sort of haphazard way that it seemed to be in the Talmud sometimes. He made it much more logical. And he didn't usually explain what his sources were, thus leading many scholars after him to try to describe what they are. So this is just one of his works, the Mishnah Torah. And Mishnah Torah meaning like the kind of the repetition of the Torah or the second Torah, which was a bit of, audacity on his part in a way, but was also an incredible scholarly work. So he wrote this in Mishnaic Hebrew, like the original Mishnah, which was completed in the year 200. And his own ancestor, Judah HaNasi, had been the person who edited the original Mishnah. So this was kind of like the new and improved Talmud and Mishnah by Maimonides. Was it accepted? It wasn't widely accepted as a code of Jewish law, except that the Yemenite community uses it as their code of Jewish law until modern times. And later on with Joseph Caro, with the Shulchan Aruch, that became more authoritative, possibly because it came out around the time of the printing press. And it's just kind of the way things went, right? Or maybe Maimonides paved the way for these later codes like the Arba Turim and the Shulchan Aruch that became much more authoritative, but he had set it up for them. And I sent you some articles about other things about his work. Another thing that he wrote was his commentary on the Mishnah. Again, the Mishnah, this early work of rabbinic law from the year 200, edited by his own ancestor, Judah HaNasi. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, and he didn't write it in Hebrew, by the way. He wrote it in Arabic. So did also the Moreh Nevuchim, this Guide for the Perplexed, when I think was also written in Arabic. The Mishnah Torah was in Hebrew. So he had translators sometimes, which is interesting, right, to think about. All right. But other little tidbits about Maimonides are that he was supported by his brother, a merchant who was a successful merchant, and so that he could devote himself to his studies. But then his brother was lost at sea in a shipwreck, and he had to go to get a day job, basically. And his day job was being the court physician in Fostad. So he was a doctor. And some of his treatises, and especially one on asthma, was, I'm told, still read until the 20th century. That some of his, of course, things were supplanted, but they lasted for centuries. And he wasn't exhausted by his lifestyle. So if you ever think like we modern people are exhausted, he wrote a famous letter to his translator. His translator said, I want to come visit you. And he basically said, don't come visit me. I'm too busy. I'm exhausted. I work all day for the Sultan and his court and all the people there. And then as soon as I get back to the Jewish quarter, they all come to me with rabbinic questions, and I barely have time to eat or anything. I don't have time to meet with you, sorry. And he'd often say, like, I'm planning to write this book or that book, and he didn't get to everything. So it's rather humbling to think that such a great man as he could not do it all. The rest of us some of us might be wasting time on Instagram or something. Certainly we're not going to get anywhere near that. Anyway, let's go. Those are some tidbits of Maimonides, but let's go back to some of his thought now. So, can we see this a little bigger? All right. So we looked at him. We looked at his cosmological argument. Now we get something more complicated, which is in his Guide for the Perplexed, which is our one book I read called it the Via Negativa, the negative way to speak about God. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Did you guys see I disappeared? And I don't know. It's like I said it was the way of negative, and I disappeared. I went into the ether and I came back. All right, let's try it again.
Maybe he's telling you something.
He's kind of annoyed with me. I think Maimonides by now I'd be annoyed with me. So basically, I find this extremely challenging to understand. I'll just say that. But basically, God is so unique, so one, that God is unlike anything. And we can't talk about God. The only way we can talk about God, even though we establish God exists and we have all the testimony of our scriptures to tell us, the laws of God. But basically, how can we talk about God? Because anything we say about God diminishes God. Even if you say that God is like alive, that would be diminishing God by saying like life is just one part of the greatness of God. So you could only say like God is not alive. Are y'all following me? I find this confusing. But who would like to read a little bit about this, and then I can share what a smarter person than me wrote about it. Anybody want to read there?
Michael.
Okay, the Via Negativa.
Yeah.
As for the negative attributes of God, they are those that must be used in order to conduct the mind toward that which must be believed with regard to him. May he be exalted, for no notion of the multiplicity to attach to him in any respect on account of them, and moreover, they conduct the mind toward the utmost reach that many may attain in the apprehension of him. May he be exalted. Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, and that's very perplexing.
I know, isn't it?
There is nothing we can say positively about God because that would limit and diminish God.
Okay, this is trying to a commentary again on what he just said. Yeah, go ahead.
When the Torah speaks of God's physical attributes, that is, speaking in the language of men, Mishnah Torah, even when we speak of God's love or mercy, we must be careful not to take that literally, because that would diminish God's oneness and uniqueness. Language, like God's mercy, only applies to our perspective, not God's essence.
All right, so even if you praise God and say God is love, how can you say that? Or God is loving even, because that's diminishing God in a sense. Who are we to describe God? I'm simplifying it. No, I was looking in Rabbi Carrie Tooling's book, which I recommended, Thinking About God. This is a pretty new book. And she describes it like this. So can I read a little bit of what she said? Because I think she could explain it better than me. She brought this long quote, what I shared here, and it's much longer. I don't know if reading the whole thing might be just too overwhelming, but here's what how she described it. The argument is subtle and often difficult to follow. The description of God's nature here is profound. God is unlike anything in the world. And again, this is Rabbi Tooling speaking. In fact, according to Maimonides, God is so completely different from anything in the world that we must depart from our everyday use of language in order to explain what God is. Some additional definitions will help elucidate the text. By the word essence, Maimonides means the defining quality of a given thing. The essence of a child's bouncy ball, for example, is roundness. An accident for Maimonides describes some aspect of a thing that is not part of its essence. A bouncy ball could be red or blue or another color, so redness is not part of the essence. Redness is an accident of the bouncy ball. Are we there? Both roundness and redness are attributes of the bouncy ball. An attribute is either an explanation of a thing's essence or an explanation of an aspect of something different than the thing's essence. It's either an explanatory attribute or an accidental attribute. So in this case, roundness is an explanatory attribute of the bouncy ball, and redness is an accidental attribute of the bouncy ball. Okay, the bouncy ball, now to God. The first category of attributes, explanatory attributes, can be split into two things: those that provide either full or partial explanations of the thing. Roundness is a partial explanation of a bouncy ball, for the ball must also be made of a material that bounces. Now, according to Maimonides, a full explanation of God is not feasible, because it is impossible to provide a complete definition of God. Any single attribute one might choose would be much too small to encompass the entirety of God. Furthermore, a partial explanation of God is also not possible. If it were possible, then God would be some sort of a composite entity made up of different attributes, A, B, and C. And God is not made up of parts. God is a total unity beyond our any comprehension. So explanatory attributes cannot be ascribed to God. Though God exists, this existence is profoundly different from the existence of inert matter or living beings. And, nothing we can say basically is, anything we could say could only diminish that. We have no right to say anything, basically. I don't know what else to tell you. He's basically saying you cannot talk about God, but the best you can do is negative language. To say, for example, let's see. When we say something like God is powerful, knowing, and willing, what we're really saying is God is not powerless, God is not ignorant, and God is not inattentive or negligent. But we can't really say what God is. Oh, okay. So I already would just be like overwhelmed, but I don't know if other people can relate to this better. That's why God's so special. Yeah. We can't really talk about God. God's beyond is. Yeah.
I was answering her. Actually, I was saying that's why Moses is special.
Because of his ability to truly apprehend God. So he goes into, Maimonides' thought, especially actually, we can see this already in his next text, I think, from the introduction to the Mishnah. We can strive to live this exemplary life, to detach ourselves from mere material pleasures, to kind of grow up, to spend more time contemplating, living the Torah, and to contemplate these higher and higher things. And this is like how we find our place in the world to come, that we would be able to achieve, a higher state of being and contemplating as much as we can of the divine, even though it's beyond us. If that's the way. Can't we extract attributes from the Torah, from God's interaction with humanity? Okay, again, I feel a little inadequate to try to explain that, but I think that what as far as I understand, what Maimonides would say is that we could say that's our experience of God. Yes, we experience God being merciful, or God being just, or God being angry, as it were, but that doesn't really mean God was angry or that God had a certain emotion, good or bad. It's like we could, say the Torah is describing our experience of it. I mean, this is getting he's saying this to the philosophical elite, not to the average person, right? I don't know if that helps. Again, I feel a little bit, at a loss to interpret Maimonides fully. but that's why I sent you some other things you could read about him. I like to share, I think it's very helpful. The thing that I sent out from his commentary in the Mishnahs, I had Audrey send out the first selection she sent out. It's his introduction to chapter 10 of Tractate Sanhedrin. And we don't really, I mean, if I was like doing it in school, you know, I could assign you to read it, but I just suggest it if you'd like to read it. What you find is that Maimonides is commenting on this famous saying that opens Tractate Sanhedrin. It's a book of the Mishnah, later of the Talmud, that talks about, it's about judicial laws and capital punishment, stuff like this. But it's talking about who has a place in the world to come. And it says all Israel have a place in the world to come. So from there, he builds this whole argument and says, it's just his wonderful style. He basically says, you know, people have different ideas of the world to come. And some people think it's just this beautiful place where you're feasting and enjoying. And he's kind of saying, you know, he tells the different ideas that people have, and basically saying like, these are very childish ideas, right? That you should serve God for reward, or you'll be rewarded in this world. But that in fact, it's all about spiritual growth, intellectual contemplation. We should serve God because that's the right thing to do. And this will bring us closer to our highest self and to godliness. And then he finishes it with these 13 principles of faith, right? Which I have on very condensed on my slide, but in the text that I sent out, he goes into a lot more detail, right? So here's his 13 principles of faith. This is my last slide tonight. And you can find these in many prayer books. If you look in an Orthodox prayer book, you'll find these in the beginning or the end of the book. And they are prefaced with the words, I believe with a perfect faith, right? That's not how it is in that introduction to the Mishnah. He just describes them in great detail, what he means by them. But basically what I hope to share with you is that he bequeathed us these ideas of what Jews should believe. And that's kind of radical, right? In the Bible and in the Talmud, there wasn't a list of things you have to believe to be a Jew. It could say, yes, don't believe in idols, don't worship idols. Okay, there's some, you know, a couple of things like that. But it doesn't say that you have to have a certain credo or a certain belief. And those ideas were often important in early Christianity, exactly what you believe, what each denomination believes. And those are the things that separate denominations or different groups. Whereas in Judaism, I always said it's deed above creed. It's what you do and not exactly what you believe. And here is Maimonides saying there are 13 principles that make you a person of the Jewish faith, not that make you a Jew, but that a Jew should believe to be part of, you know, this group that's going to have a place in the world to come. So I thought somebody could read those to us. But again, remembering that this is just a very, very short version of what he wrote in that whole essay in his introduction to the chapter 10 of Mishnah Sanhedrin. So somebody want to read this?
Elsa has her hand raised.
Okay.
I didn't realize I did, but okay. Yep.
Okay.
So belief in the existence of the Creator, be he blessed, who is perfect in every manner of existence and is the primary cause of all that exists. The belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity. The belief in God's non-corporeality, nor that he will be affected by any physical occurrences such as movement or rest or dwelling. The belief in God's eternity, the imperative to worship him exclusively and no foreign false gods. The belief that God communicates with man through prophecy. The belief that the prophecy of Moses, our teacher, has priority. The belief in the divine origin of the Torah. The belief in the immutability of the Torah. The belief in divine omniscience and providence. The belief in divine reward and retribution. The belief in the arrival of the Messiah and the Messianic era. The belief in the resurrection of the dead.
Okay, so that one about the Messiah, that's like gotten to the song that we just sang, Ani Ma'amin, right? If you think about it again, in every prayer book, including our prayer book that we use at Seaside, which is a Reformed prayer book. It has these made into a song called Yigdal, although the version we have, being more Reformed, changed it a little bit. But I think they took out the resurrection of the dead. And by the way, at least I was told by my professor that we're not really sure if Maimonides really believed in the resurrection of the dead. That didn't fit in very well with his way of thinking, but it was such a big traditional Jewish belief, he kind of had to include it. But there seemed to be some evidence that maybe he just left it in there because that's part of Jewish Orthodox tradition at that time. But that wouldn't have set well with his whole idea about spirituality, right? And, there was kind of a big mishmash of Jewish beliefs in the world to come, and he was able to put them together in a certain order to say, well, there's going to be messianic days when we have our own kingdom, and then there's going to be resurrection. But the ultimate good is that we'll be able to have like a contemplation of God that's more spiritual. I'm trying to find this in the text that I sent you guys. Okay. Here. Again, well, it's the introduction to Perek Chelek. Perek Chelek is the chapter about all Israel have chelek, have a place in the world to come. And to read you a little bit of it again. Well, actually, I'm going to let's read this together, and then we'll just turn to some discussion, concluding discussion, okay? So I'm going to try to show you something on my screen that's not the slideshow. Are you ready? Let's try it. This is the thing that was sent out to you. It's like 23 pages long, so we're just going to look at a little bit of it. This is a little bit of this introduction of Maimonides to this chapter of the Mishnah. Can you see where it says, nevertheless? Even though we want to achieve our share in the world to come, what does he say is the ultimate good? Someone, can you see it on the screen? Nonetheless, yes, someone want to read that? Anybody else who hasn't read yet want to read? Or who has read yet and nobody else? Gabrielle, do you want to read that?
Yep.
Okay. Wait, is she there? I don't know.
Gabrielle, please.
I am muted. Nevertheless, even though this is the end we seek, he who wishes to serve God out of love should not serve him to attain the world to come. He should rather believe that wisdom exists, that this wisdom is the Torah, that the Torah has given the prophets was given the prophets by God, the Creator, that in the Torah he taught us virtues which are the commandments and vices that are sins. In so doing, he will perfect the specifically human which resides in him and will be genuinely different from the animals. When one becomes fully human, he acquires the nature of the perfect human being. There is no external power to deny his soul eternal life. His soul thus attains the eternal life it has come to know, which is the world to come, as we have explained. This is the meaning of the verse, quote, "Be not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle," unquote. Restraints which prevent animals from acting in accordance with their nature are external ones, like the bit and the bridle. With man, the influences which restrain him are his control of self. When a man achieves human perfection, it restrains him from doing those things which are called vices and which withhold perfection from him. It urges and impels him toward those things which are called virtues and which bring him to full perfection. This is what all the teachings of the sages have made clear to me about this most important matter.
Okay, I'm going to stop here. So I hope it would give you a teaser to read that whole. It's actually kind of readable. I know it seems very serious, but it's always fun to watch Maimonides make fun of other people, because he definitely had a lot of scorn for people who were not at his level, at times. And I'm just, for example, there was someone wrote to Maimonides once, and there was, asking him a question, and said, when I get up, I'm a convert. When I get up and pray that I'm the son of, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, some people say you can't our God and God of our fathers. You can't say our God and God of our fathers because you're a convert. They're not your fathers. And boy, did Maimonides give it to that guy that would say such a thing to a convert. He's saying, no, you are the son of Abraham and you're a spiritual son. He just, he gave his opinion as he saw it. So, and he came down on the side of the converts in that case. Yeah, David.
So one thing I noticed with respect to that last belief in the resurrection
Yes.
of the dead,
Yes.
in this commentary that this article that you showed us,
Yeah.
they're speaking about resurrection of the soul, which is not exactly the same thing as resurrection of the dead, that some people believe, multiple lives, et cetera, et cetera.
Wait, in Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah, or in a different article?
What you just read.
I was just reading.
What was just read.
It's interesting because he says when he gets to the 13th principle, he says the 13th principle is the resurrection of the dead, which we already explained. So he doesn't really want to go into it very much, because to him it's just kind of okay, it's in the Torah or in the Torah. It's like in the prophets, there's some allusion to it. And I guess it's going to happen, but that's not the main thing, right? Because the main thing is the spiritual perfection.
Correct. Well, and it talks about resurrection of the soul.
Okay.
And not necessarily resurrection of dead bodies.
Okay. Well, I guess you read it better than I did even, so I'll just leave it at that. But I definitely think that wasn't resurrection of the dead was not something he wanted to dwell on, clearly. So, usually I break things into, Michael, did you want to say something?
Nothing. It's just that there was something else in there that kind of followed that if excuse me for this word, but anyway, free your mind and your ass will follow. If your soul is resurrected, then everything else will follow. And there was something else about studying in there, I think, that he said too, just about how you just as you open yourself up and then everything else will work.
Okay. Well, he's talking about how you can live a better life, a life of virtue, a life of, if you read the whole thing, he's like, don't just be seeking your pleasure and your bodily functions and stuff like that, or trying to make a lot of money, but you should be trying to perfect yourself. Then you'll eventually achieve this in the world to come. But even now, you'll achieve a greater life as a fully expressed human, image of God. And I think, again, he was bringing in some ideas that were there in Greek thought too, right? How to live a good life. What is the good life? And yet he's combining it with Jewish ideas of ethics and virtue, and he's sort of making a synthesis. So as I was saying, we have 11 minutes left to class, and I usually do I thought I would really give breakout rooms, but I think as we have a kind of a small group tonight, we don't really need to do breakout rooms, but I'd like to invite you into a little conversation with everyone who's here. And by the way, if you had friends that didn't come tonight, tell them next week's the last class, and it's going to be about Kabbalah, so I can get into that. So be sure to tell people to come back for Kabbalah. But I would say a little bit about belief and credo. So interestingly, my teacher, Reb Zalman, talked about being a rather rebellious, Orthodox teenager back in Europe. His family eventually fled kind of a step ahead of the Nazis and came to the US. They were interred once in a camp, in a labor camp in France, but they made their way to the US somehow. And he said when he was learning, he was a little rebellious. And when they were talking about the world to come and what to expect in heaven and all that, he said, well, I don't believe that's all just a lot of nonsense, big rock candy mountains, he said. And all the other students who were Orthodox boys were mad at him, and his teacher said, wait, I have someone who agrees with you. And he started reading him what Maimonides wrote, and he said, Maimonides agreed with you. This isn't talking about some kind of place of physical pleasure, but about a spiritual perfection. And, this gave him a whole new way of looking at things. And then he said, well, just as Maimonides wrote a credo, we should try to write our own credo. So the first class I ever took with my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Reb Zalman, was he called it Credo for a Modern Kabbalist. He tried to write his own credo, and he thought we should write our own credo, much as Maimonides has his 13 Articles of Faith. Again, we just saw the bullet points. You got to read the whole thing. But that too often we as Jews don't articulate our beliefs very well. And again, should we? Because is that really a Jewish thing? Is Jewish idea of belief really a set of principles in your mind, a set of doctrines that you must adhere to? I'm not so sure. I think the Jewish word for emunah, faith, in traditional biblical thought, it really meant like faithfulness, keeping the faith, a sense of faithfulness to God, to people, and really only in the Middle Ages, a lot through the influence of Maimonides, did it get this secondary meaning of beliefs or creeds or doctrines. Nonetheless, it's still a useful exercise, I think, for us to try to write our own kind of, I believe. It doesn't have to be a set of 13 principles of faith, but kind of a statement. Could you create something like that? Could you say what you believe? That's why I shared that little inventory of your own theology as a tool for you to start looking at what you believe and considering, do I even know what I believe, or do I just have kind of some squishy gut feelings about things, or have I really thought about it? And of course, it doesn't have to stay static. It should change, and it should be different than what it was when you were younger or hadn't gone through as many life experiences. So I wanted to ask you, I'm going to take you back again to this slide of, well, I won't take you back to the slide, but I'll just remind you that slide that there's different ways to be a believer: through rational, through your mind, logic, empirical, through your experiences, existential, through your kind of what supports you in life, what gives meaning to your life. And then there's those who could say, well, I don't know and I don't believe. But do you have any kind of a credo? Have you even thought about that? And have you thought about your style of beliefs and how you can articulate them? I guess I know some people are going like, what is the question there again? I'll read you the questions I wrote. What's your style of belief? Can you articulate your credo? We'll stop it right at that. And, you might be thinking of such questions, not as about Greek philosophy, but about science, about why life is the way it is. And do you have a set of beliefs that you could give to your kids if you have kids, or to, to the next generation? Anybody want to share? Even if you've given it some thought? This kind of group breakout room here. Gabrielle?
I discovered tonight that there's a name for what the way I think of God, empiricist. That was very helpful for tonight. Yeah. And regrettably, I have the second question, can you articulate my credo? The answer is no. And it's really been a detriment because perhaps as a role model, I've shown my children the belief in God. However, when we ever discussed it, I would just say, well, it's as if it were just air. And that is not who they're in their 40s, age 40 to 50 right now. That's not who they were ever. So I feel like if I had only been able to articulate, as this question, articulate my credo, it would have been helpful for them. And therefore, being an empiricist is difficult. Anyway, that's it. So I'm having trouble articulating.
Well, it's the challenge is to articulate. I don't know, but it could even be to be able to just say, to be able to articulate that, to be able to say, well, I come to God through experience, not through, some the logos, as you said, as we had in some of the books, that through words that I can just to give principles of faith, but I come through my experiences like this and like this and like this. And that's what it left me with. Maybe that's the way you write that,
But if I may, just not to take too much time, but the problem is if they don't, and I've had long conversations with children that I've known all their lives, they feel remiss if they see a rainbow and what they notice is it's pouring rain and their outfits is going to get messy, they don't have the joy or the connection to God I do, and then it makes them feel lesser. So that's a problem.
Okay. Well, if it's any consolation, I just think that everyone has to come to it for themselves. So it's not, you do your best. Okay, and then we
you got
David,
two hands up. We have I think Ellen and then David.
Okay.
So I think I'm probably like many people. I think I'm more of a hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a rationalist. Mm-hmm. Even when I was in Hebrew school, I remember saying to my teacher, how do I know that God is real? Mm-hmm. I mean, it started many, many years ago. And, as I grow up and as I age, of course, it changes over time. So then I have some more empirical proof, things that have happened throughout my life. But still but that still rational, pragmatic part of me is still there. So for me, it's keeping an open mind, but also being a hybrid. Absolutely.
Thanks. Sometimes I think in my family, some of them were Polish Jews, some of them were Russian, Ukrainian Jews. One was Lithuanian, and the Lithuanians were known as the Litvak was known as the rationalist, the skeptic, if you will. And I think there's still a little bit of that in me, even though I tend to be one of those more touchy-feely.
Just a quick tidbit. So that's interesting because my family is from Lithuania. So
go those Litvaks. Okay. Yeah, people get a little as I say, I would say I'm the empiricist, and yet if it gets a little too just, what's the word? I don't know. Well, if it seems just too gullible or just too simplistic, then my little Litvak antenna might go up, I guess. Okay. All right. Who else was?
David was the
David. Okay.
Right. I don't know if I'm an outlier or not, but I never felt the need to articulate my religion to anybody. I felt like if they saw the way I lived and how I acted, that was my religion. And with my kids, I just always wanted them to do as I showed as an experience versus sitting them down and asking them to memorize. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I just never felt the need to articulate anything or have rules that they needed to memorize and then espouse that to their friends and try to convince people. It was really about, how I live my life. And I want that to be my creed. And I want them to say, I'm going to live my life like Dad was, and to me, that's my religion. So I was really uncomfortable with the 13
right.
rules,
Well,
so anti-Jewish, to have a list of 13 things that is more like a cult. And I never felt, so I don't know, maybe I'm an outlier with that.
No, well, I don't think you're the outlier. I think in a sense, the very fact that Maimonides created, he got critiques. Not everyone accepted the code of law. Not everyone accepted that he stated certain things and in fact, that seemed to be an innovation on traditional Judaism, which was not based so much on creed as on deed, exactly what you're saying. But the way that you just said it, again, I'd love it if we wrote a book of these, the things that everyone said tonight, right? Whether it was, I've seen things that I could only be miracles, or make it into a rap or something or I've had experiences that have confirmed for me, or I don't think I have to articulate it. I have it as my, I think my life speaks, that is my faith. That is, in fact, I think, oh my gosh, there's a verse in the Bible that which I'll think about probably as soon as we turn off the Zoom, but it's, the righteous should sort of find God through life. You exemplify it, just like you're saying. And I think, again, I'm always teaching that kind of as a saying, deed above creed, and traditionally in Judaism. So only the 13 articles of faith, do I believe them all? No. I would write totally different ones today. I don't think it's like that we all should follow what Maimonides said. And we're not sure if he 100% believed the last one himself. So But the fact that you articulated, though, David, that like to you, living a good life, living an ethical life, if I understand it right, a moral, ethical life, a life of contribution and so on, that is your faith. That itself is a creed, to be able to just, I mean, you don't have to actually articulate it, but it's nice to articulate it. And again, I think that is closer to the original idea of Jewish faith, was faithfulness to your ideals, or faithfulness to, what you believe in and the way you should live your life. So I think that takes us to our closing time. I want to thank you for being here, coming out on this cold and foggy night to your Zoom.
Thank you.
And tell your friends to come back and join us next week for Kabbalah. That'll be a good one. And I'm going to shut this off. Okay. Yeah.